Before the amazing events of the Miracle on the Hudson with Captain Sully, there was the story of South Pacific Aeromotive's DC-3 ditch-in by Captain Rod Lovell.
I got out, Charlie negative, we're going to have to ditch you.
In 1994, Captain Lovell successfully ditched his DC-3 aircraft, saving the lives of 25 people. An amazing feat, and luckily for us, he joins us in this video to describe what happened on that defining day.
Performance was gone. It wasn't accelerating, it wasn't climbing, and in fact speed was starting to wash off.
This story starts on the 24th of April 1994. South Pacific Aeromotive, or more specifically, this DC-3 aircraft, registration Victor Hotel Echo Delta Charlie, was scheduled to carry band students from Scots College and a team of journalists from the newspaper The Australian. They were to be transported from Sydney Kingsford Smith Airport to Norfolk Island to perform in Anzac Day celebrations. There were 21 passengers, the 2 pilots at the front with an additional supernumerary pilot, and 1 flight attendant, totaling 25 people on board. Captain Rod Lovell studied the route and filed the flight plan, which would take them to Norfolk Island via Lord Howe Island for a fuel stop. Both airports were notified, the correct fuel was booked, the weather was checked and NOTAMs were reviewed. Once Captain Lovell was happy, he submitted the flight plan and then made his way to the airport with the supernumerary pilot Andrew Buxton. Andrew was there to gain some experience in observing remote island operations. Captain Lovell and Andrew arrived to the aircraft at 0730 local Sydney time. Nick Leach, the first officer, or co-pilot, is already at the aircraft and carrying out the pre-flight checks. Their scheduled takeoff time is 0900. Captain Lovell and Andrew then board the aircraft, with Rod inspecting the safety equipment, while Nick, the first officer, carries out the pre-start checks. At 0830, as the aircraft is located away from the loading apron, they start engines, and before taxiing to the loading apron, run-up checks are carried out. These check the status of the aircraft systems. Once the pilots are happy, they taxi to Hawker Pacific's apron, where they meet the passengers and start to load the baggage and freight. Captain Lovell instructed the ground crew where the load was going to be put. As he had already completed the load and trim paperwork, he was faxed the passengers' details a few days before, so was able to complete it in advance.
I was under the impression that there were only 24 souls on board total because somebody had cancelled the night before. So we had actually had less than we thought we had. So we were well within the takeoff weight, well under.
The passengers now started to board the aircraft. The weather was beautiful as forecast. The wind was light and variable, visibility was greater than 10 kilometers, the sky was clear with a temperature of 18 degrees Celsius or 64 degrees Fahrenheit. With the passengers boarded, the aircraft was secured and the pilots started to set up for their trip. Captain Lovell was in the left seat with Nick in the right seat. Nick was going to be the pilot's flying and Rod was the pilot's not flying or pilot's monitoring. For the crew, Captain Lovell had a wide range of experience, starting his career in the Royal Australian Air Force in 1968. During his Air Force career, he flew in the Mirage and Lockheed Orion until 1978, when he left the Air Force to fly civilian aircraft. He then flew the Argosy, DC-3, DC-9, Learjet, Citation, King Air, and even gained a Boeing 747 endorsement. He held an air transport pilot's license with a total of 9,186 flying hours and 927 on type. The first officer held a commercial pilot's license and had a total of 500 flying hours with 250 on type. The supernumerary pilot also held an air transport pilot's license with a total of 2,741 flying hours, but only 22 hours on type. Once the engines were started, the crew called that they were ready for taxi, and they were cleared to the Bravo 3 intersection for runway 16. They began to taxi at 0900. Sydney Airport at the time had 2 working runways, runway 1634, which was the longest runway at 3,962 metres, and runway 0725, which was 2,530 metres. There was a further runway being built, which was due to be a parallel runway to 16. This runway extended deeper into the bay, but at the time in 1994, it was still under construction and not in use. Whilst the DC-3 was taxiing to the hold, the crew carried out final sanity checks before starting their pre-takeoff checks. The DC-3 they would be flying today was 50 years old, with it being manufactured in the final years of World War II in 1944. It wasn't registered until 1949, and since that time had flown 40,195 hours. The two Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines were over 1,000 hours since their last overhaul, with the left engine on 1,028 hours and the right engine on 1,086 hours. According to the final report, both engines were operating on Civil Aviation Authority approved concessions to overrun the published time before overhaul of 1,000 hours. The DC-3 then arrived at the Bravo 3 hold, and after one final check that everyone was ready to go, they subsequently called they were ready for departure. At 0907, they were cleared for takeoff. The first officer entered the runway and lined the DC-3 up with the centerline. With Rod covering the power levers, Nick then moved the power levers forward, setting takeoff power.
So, when given takeoff clearance, we applied maximum takeoff power and everything appeared normal. All the indications, there was nothing abnormal at this stage.
The DC-3 started to roll down the runway, and once it's approximately 45 knots, the iconic tail lift begins, and the DC-3 continues its takeoff roll on the two main landing gear wheels. Inside the flight deck, all the indications appear normal, and the takeoff roll runs as expected. The speed increased until approximately 81 knots when Rod signaled with his hands for the first officer to rotate. This was standard practice as the sound of the engines at takeoff made it nearly impossible to hear each other, so hand signals were used. The first officer then rotated the aircraft, and they took off from runway 16 en route to Lord Howe Island. The crew confirmed a positive rate of climb, and Captain Lovell selected the undercarriage up. They were approximately 200 feet above the ground, with a speed in excess of 100 knots. They then started to hear popping sounds coming from the engines.
And at about 200 feet, we observed or heard was just a couple of muffled bangs from the left-hand engine.
The first officer then states that they've lost the left engine, and the aircraft starts to yaw to the left.
Echo Charlie's got a slight problem. We'll just stand by.
Charlie.
The first officer controls the aircraft, trying to keep it climbing and flying straight. Captain Lovell then looks inside at the instruments and confirms that the left engine has failed.
He called left engine failure. I confirmed it, and we did their phase 1 checks, which is emergency shutdown checks, and then the phase 2, which are confirming that phase 1s have been done.
Also informing air traffic control that they have an issue.
Echo Charlie, confirm operation as normal.
Negative. We've got just shut down the left engine. We'll be returning very shortly. Let's keep it going 81 knots again, Nick.
One of the most important actions on an engine failure is to ensure that the prop has feathered. This is where the blades of the prop turn to reduce their surface area into the airflow. If this doesn't occur, then the aircraft will have a massive disc of drag. Captain Lovell immediately feathers the prop in accordance with the emergency procedures checklist and visually checks to see that it has feathered. It appears to be in the fully feathered position, and he informs the first officer. For the passengers in the back, they immediately know something is wrong, as they can see from the windows that they are no longer going up, and they can feel and hear that the left engine is not working. In the flight deck, Captain Lovell expected to see the aircraft climbing away, but it was still at approximately 200 feet, slightly left of the runway centerline, and with the speed reducing. The DC-3 is more than capable of climbing away on a single engine, and for Captain Lovell, that's what he expected to see. His instant plan was to climb away and return to Sydney Airport, but it's starting to look like this is going to be an impossible task, with the aircraft showing signs that it's not going to be able to stay in the air.
At this stage, that was my intention when I closed down the number 1 engine. I intended to come around for however, things changed drastically. It's amazing how all the things we do in the simulator Millions of times, we're practicing your pilot, we're going to do this, and this was nothing like that. What happened was, it was so fine, and I wondering, and all of a sudden, the performance was gone. It wasn't accelerating, it wasn't climbing, and in fact, speed was starting to wash off.
The crew ensure that the right power lever is set at maximum power, but still the aircraft is failing to climb. The first officer is applying full right rudder and using right aileron to attempt to hold the aircraft straight. Captain Rod Lovell then takes control and assesses the situation.
So with that, I said to Nick, taking over the side took control of the aeroplane as the normal procedures, he said handing over. And then I thought, what am I going to do? And I had to think very fast because the aeroplane was not performing and I knew we weren't going to make it around from runway 25.
As there was runway still beneath them, there was an option to land straight ahead on the remaining runway. He wasn't 100% sure of where in the cycle the landing gear was. The DC-3 landing gear is hydraulically operated, but there isn't a mechanical connection between the DC-3's two main landing gear legs. This meant that one of the two wheels will nearly always retract, or in this case extend, before the other. This also takes time, under normal circumstances using two hydraulic pumps, one off each engine. But in this case, only one hydraulic pump was available, meaning the process would take even longer and could lead to the aircraft landing on one main landing gear wheel, which puts the aircraft in a more dangerous position.
You'll see one leg come up and one leg sort of think about coming up and then it comes up. So that is not a really nice way to land an aeroplane with one gear up and one down. So I decided not to do that.
The further effect was an almost guaranteed runway excursion off the end of the runway. At the end of runway 16 are large concrete blocks to break the sea swell and protect the sea wall. If the DC-3 was to hit these blocks, it would more than likely break apart, and with a full fuel load on board, it would rupture the fuel tanks, leading to an explosive fire. So this was not an option. Looking to the left, there was the construction of the new runway 16 left, a runway parallel to their track and extending further out to sea. At this time, the runway had vehicles, construction equipment, and an unfinished runway surface, so it wouldn't be an appropriate option. Even if it was, the aircraft didn't have enough performance to make it across safely. If Rod was to turn the aircraft left towards that runway, the additional loss of lift from the turn would have most likely caused them to crash in the process. So this wasn't an option either.
The performance I would have lost in sidestepping, I wouldn't have made it. So that wasn't an option.
Rod was running out of options and time was not on his side. He thought of a similar incident in 1980 where a Beech Super King Air 200 lost an engine on takeoff from runway 25. In that case, the pilot attempted to turn and land on runway 34, the reciprocal of runway 16. They crashed short, hitting the runway 16 seawall with a loss of all on board.
A King Air took off on runway 25 to Sydney. He basically lost an engine and he tried to make it back and he crashed into the seawall. And that seawall was just down there. And I know because in 1980 I landed about 30 minutes after that tragic accident and it was incredible. The smoke was still there, the emergency services, everything like that. So when I was deciding what to do, I had this incredible, I don't know what they call it, a presence or a voice or what, saying, whatever you do, don't let that out of your passenger's rod. It was an incredibly powerful, overwhelming voice, notion, whatever, because 13 people died, including a 1-week-old baby, just down there. And that was the biggest, do it right, Rod.
Captain Lovell's mind was made up. In the matter of seconds he had to make a decision, he determined that the safest option for everyone was to ditch in Botany Bay.
Echo Charlie, Shutdown waited.
Okay. Echo Charlie, negative, we're going to have to ditch you.
Roger.
So I decided to ditch. I thought that was the safest option and still good, very much so. As we were coming in, I had to actually swerve. There were a few plenty of boats. It was Sunday morning. Few fishermen out there. They actually had to maneuver a little bit to miss one of the boats.
Captain Lovell positioned the aircraft in the ditching position, called for full flaps with the landing gear up. He then manoeuvred around a few boats in the bay before then lowering the aircraft to just feet above the surface of the water. He pulled back the power for the right engine and held the attitude, allowing the speed to wash off as much as possible while still maintaining control of the aircraft.
So just rotated to what I thought was the ditching position. I did notice, and I still remember, the perspective is a lot lower, naturally it is, but it gives you some of these things credit. The ditching was, I'd say, firm. It wasn't smooth. It didn't bounce, but it was firm. We were down, and we ditched. I was very happy with the ditching speed. I estimated we ditched it probably around 63 to 65 knots, which was flat. I was very happy because when I was seeing a ditching or crashing an aeroplane or anything like that, is to have the lowest potential energy kinetic energy. It really is, just to get the speed down. So I'm very happy.
Then, only 46 seconds after the engine had failed, the DC-3 touched the water tail first, and then in an instant, the nose pitched down and a wall of water rolled over the aircraft. Rod and Nick were thrown forward, and the aircraft came to a stop, floating on the water and turning slightly to the right.
Economic Charlie, get back, kick the back. Economic Charlie, get back in the back. Change that till it's on the ground. Right.
In the flight deck, the fire warning bell and undercarriage warning horn is blaring.
Stop. Let's get everybody out.
Captain Lovell checks on the rest of the flight crew, and as the water and movement starts to settle, he tried to remove the overstimulating alarms. The fire bell is silenced, but the undercarriage warning will not stop. Even after disconnecting the battery, it is still continuous. The first officer then states that the electrics have shorted. Everything up front appears intact. Captain Lovell now turns to check the status of the cabin. He expected to see chaos, but instead he sees passengers standing up and calmly putting on their life jackets, and in this moment, Captain Lovell feels an overwhelming feeling of relief.
And at that stage, I looked around down the back and I was expecting to see carnage. I really was. And I was, and to this day, very proud of passengers. They were highly disciplined. They made school kids, these were my school kids. They were highly disciplined. They were standing up, putting their life jackets on, getting the life rafts ready. There was no panic, no confusion. There was nothing like that. They did a great job. They really did.
Andrew, the supernumerary pilot, then jumps up and immediately assists with the passengers. The aircraft is floating well. Captain Lovell looks out the window and sees multiple boats converging on the aircraft. Part of the reason he ditched in the bay, rather than the far side of the runway, was due to the number of pleasure boats that would be able to assist. He signals a larger boat approaching the aircraft, and suggests to the first officer they could take a line and attach the aircraft to the boat to be pulled to shallower water. However, it became clear very quickly that this was not going to be an option. Water was rapidly filling the aircraft, with water entering the flight deck from below the floor. Time was now running out again to get everyone off the aircraft before it sunk below the water. Captain Lovell then headed back into the cabin to speed up the evacuation and ensure everyone was off the aircraft. During the ditching, the flight attendant was injured, and at this point, Captain Lovell found out she had already been taken off in an inflatable life raft and transferred to a boat. The first officer grabbed the DC-3 red flight folder and climbed out of the overhead hatch on the top of the fuselage. He then managed to walk down the aircraft to the tailplane, where he then jumped off to an assisting boat, all without getting wet. For Captain Lovell, he did a final check of the cabin, ensuring everyone had been evacuated, before then jumping into the water with the supernumerary pilot from the rear door.
When we closed everything down up the cockpit, I started to get out, and Andrew and myself walked down the back very slowly, the same as Sully did in the movie, and to make sure there were no passengers trapped under the seats or in luggage or compartments or anything like that. And then when we were happy, we left the aeroplane, jumped out into the water and then into a boat.
All of the 25 passengers and crew were transported to shore and then onto multiple hospitals for analysis. Meanwhile, the DC-3 sunk to the bottom of Botany Bay.
when you're sitting on a boat looking at your aeroplane in the water, the fuel factor kicks in like you wouldn't believe. There's an aeroplane that you're in command of in the water about 50 metres away, and you think, why is it there? What did I do wrong? I just can't believe it. It must be my fault. So that kicks in, and it's not a nice feeling. It's really not a nice feeling at all, because you don't know at that time what has caused it.
After all the passengers and crew had been checked, by 14:30 that afternoon, everyone had been released from hospital, apart from the flight attendant, who had received serious injuries, as she had a broken left wrist. Out of the rest of the passengers, only 2 received minor injuries. It was found that the flight attendant unstrapped just after takeoff due to miscommunication between her and the first officer.
I spoke to her afterwards in the hospital, and she said that Nick, the co-pilot and owner of the aeroplane, he told her that once we're able, she was allowed to unbuckle. Now, that is a big no-no, and I was never aware of that until she told me, because I certainly would not have allowed it. So as she was unbuckled, as we just taken off, she was unrestrained and went over a couple of rows of seats and obviously put her hands out.
This caused her to be projected over the last passenger seats row before the ditching. She was reported to be concussed and confused whilst being transferred to the life raft. After the event, she described that she had no recollection of the ditching. The actions from Captain Lovell undoubtedly saved 25 lives, and what initially started as a hero's welcome soon took a turn to who was to blame. The big question looming over this incident was, why didn't the DC-3 climb away on a single engine? A few days after the ditching, investigators arrived on scene and organised for the DC-3 to be raised from the Botany Bay seabed. Inflatable bags were used to lift the aircraft to the surface. The right engine detached from the aircraft and remained under the sea for a further 9 weeks before it was brought to the surface. Investigators first looked at why the engine failed, something that needs a quick answer so other DC-3s around the world can be protected against known faults. After examining the engine, it was found that one of the cylinder inlet valve rocker mechanisms was incorrectly assembled, and because of this, it allowed a thrust washer to jam the valve open. This meant that the firing of the spark plugs on the cylinder with the valve jammed open would cause the air-fuel mixture to ignite, both resulting in a loss of power to the number 3 cylinder, but also disruption to the mixture of all the other cylinders. Fire residues and soot deposits were found in the intake manifold and air intake, showing signs of the engine backfiring and a possible intake fire. There were many other issues discovered, including base studs that were sheared and missing, spark plugs that were worn beyond normal life and with an incorrect gap setting, and gears and bolts found worn well beyond service limits. With the confirmation of the faults of the left engine, reasons for the lack of performance were still needed. The right engine was also checked after its recovery from the water, and it was discovered to have no pre-existing abnormalities. This is something that Captain Lovell disputes and states that the engine was not producing full power, claiming that the engines were both maintained in the same condition, and with the reported faults with the left engine, it is likely that the right engine was not operating at 100%. He was sent further BASI documents that show that 13 out of the 22 spark plugs on the right engine were unserviceable, and corroborates the claim of less than optimal performance from the right engine. It was also discovered that the left propeller that was feathered after the engine failure didn't feather completely. The fully feathered prop would turn the blade angle to 88 degrees, but the blades were found to be stuck at 65 to 66 degrees. This is something that would increase the amount of drag that the aircraft was subjected to. This is quite a significant factor. When you lose power, drag is something you want to minimize. Considering this is a 50-year-old aircraft, the amount of parasitic drag would be much higher than when it was first made. The panels would be worn and dented, extra aerials would have been added, and panels wouldn't fit as flush as they once did. On their own, these issues are very manageable, but when the performance is on the limit, those issues, with the additional drag from a not fully feathered propeller, can be quite serious. One other factor was the max takeoff weight of the aircraft. Captain Lovell completed the weight and balance based on anticipated weights of the passengers and baggage. The investigation reports that after requesting the passengers for their weight and baggage weight, that the aircraft was 4.7% above its maximum takeoff weight. This is something that would have restricted the rate of climb, but even at this higher number, the aircraft should have been able to provide a slight rate of climb or even maintain level. Captain Lovell states that he saw the baggage being weighed while still soaking wet, and when he questioned it, they informed him the results would be factored with this in mind. With all that said, 25 people were able to walk away from this incident, with excellent crew resource management being the cause. From the point of the engine failure, Captain Lovell had 46 seconds to make a decision and act on it, and if a different one had been made, this video might be telling a very different story. It is without a doubt that this is a miracle, with water landings being notoriously difficult and usually resulting in disaster. I hope the actions of this crew are remembered that way, and I'd like to thank Rod Lovell for taking the time to share this incredible story with us. If you would like to dive a little deeper or know more about Rod's journey through this incident and his road to redemption, he has written a book about it called Hero to Zero, and I will link that along with his website in the description. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you could click the like button, and if you want to see more of these videos, click the subscribe button for more of these videos to come. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.